Hi, all. So, I hope that we're all still here and engaged and that you've adjusted to the format of the class. Please do feel free to email me or schedule a time to chat if you have any questions. The topic for this lecture is Conceptual Issues in Race, Ethnicity, and Health. In your introductions, I am sure that several of you will describe having some experience working or learning about racial and ethnic health disparities, while others of us have not. Therefore, it is important to discuss the concepts of race and ethnicity and understand their origins so that we can all share a common understanding of the topic. So here we go. Early on, race began as a set of categories to classify humans. In 1797, a German physiologist named Blumenbach described what he called the five-fold classification of man. You see here the categories that he named from Caucasian, white, to American, red. These classifications were made on the basis of geographic considerations and the clustering of physical features such as skin color and hair type. In the 1940s and beyond, we began to see objections to these classifications of race. In particular, in 1942, Montague wrote The Fallacy of Race, in which he attacked the scientific validity of the concept of race and denounced the foundations of race as a biological concept. In the 1970s, we began to see scientists asserting that there is no biological evidence to support the existence of race groups. Others have suggested that races do not exist at all, and social sciences believe that races are social categories that have an important impact on people's lives and their health. At different points during the term, I would try to point you to different external aids that will help illustrate some of the topics that we're discussing. Here is one of those times. Watch episode number 1, entitled The Difference Between Us, of the documentary series Race, The Power of an Illusion. A link to the video is posted in this week's folder. In your reflection journals for this week, summarize the episode. And additionally, I'd like you to describe your reaction to Scene 8 and what this information about race means about our current racial classifications. In addition to the aforementioned objections to classifications of race, there are a number of other issues to consider. First, the concept has not been consistently applied. I'll discuss an illustration of this in the next slide. Secondly, race is often confounded with other related concepts such as ethnicity and nationality, which we'll differentiate in just a moment. And third, the existence of differences between races has little support from biological or genetic research. That said, there have been a variety of different conceptualizations of race to consider beyond that of Blumenbach. For example, there is the one-drop rule. This is described as the belief that if a person has a drop of non-white blood, then they are classified as that race. Another concept to consider is that classifications of race have varied by era and location. For instance, before 1989 in the U.S., the race of the father determined the race of the child. Post-1989, the race of the mother determines the race of the child. In Japan, prior to 1985, the father's race determined the child's race. After 1985, a child is considered Japanese if either parent is Japanese. So, what does all this mean? Today in the U.S., if a black mother has a child, let's call her Lucy, with her Japanese husband, the child is black. If that family were in Japan, Lucy would be Japanese. Clear as mud? Point being that in the case of this example, one might suggest that this whole notion of race is arbitrary. Lucy didn't change in the course of an airplane ride and traveling from the US to Japan, so why did her race? Constructing Whiteness references a work by Daniels and Schultz, citation provided here, where they discuss the idea of comparing racial groups, typically minority groups, to whites. They discuss what a comparison to whites tells us and explore why we often make these comparisons in health disparities research. So, what does all of this mean about race? Loosely quoted from The Difference Between Us, some say that race classification is cultural. As aforementioned, we've come to a basic understanding of race as a social construct. That is, a method of socially categorizing different groups of people rather than there being a biological basis or difference from one race to the next. In fact, there is more genetic similarity between races than there is within a particular race. Now, a bit about what race is and what it is not. Race has been defined as phenotypically and or geographically distinctive subspecific group composed of individuals inhabiting a defined geographic and or ecological region and possessing characteristic phenotypic and gene frequencies that distinguish it from other such groups. We see a reference here to phenotype, that is, one's outward appearance, and geography, as were noted by Blumenbach. Perhaps, by no surprise, this is a definition from the Dictionary of Genetics. Race is also defined as a group that is socially defined but on the basis of physical criteria, including skin color and racial features. By no surprise, the mention of a social reference is noted by a psychologist, Beverly Tatum. Race can often be confused with other somewhat similar and related terms. These include ethnicity and nationality. So let's define those terms here. Ethnicity describes a cultural commonality and has been defined from the recognition of others as a distinct group and by common cultural, linguistic, religious, behavioral, or biological traits. In contrast, nationality refers to membership in a particular nation and is recognized by being a citizen of a particular country. So, who cares? What is really the big deal about confounding race? When you do see race mentioned or referenced, I would encourage you to consider if race is really what we're talking about. In fact, when we confuse or confound race, it could lead to erroneous interpretations of research findings. For example, we might see statistically significant differences between two particular race groups in infant mortality. Is this difference based on differences in the race of the persons affected, or is race a way to capture other important aspects such as poverty or access to health care? Confounding race could also lead to ineffective public policy and public health programming. So, here again, if we see differences in race groups in infant mortality, that is, we see higher rates of infant mortality among blacks compared to whites, and thus we decide to develop public health programs targeted toward blacks, when in fact their lack of access to care could be driving the differences that we see, then what of the group of whites who don't have adequate access to care? Should they not be targeted for programs? Also, confounding race can lead to a lack of consistency when comparing data. I would draw your attention to the previously mentioned example where the child, Lucy, is black in America and Japanese in Japan. The way that we racially classify Lucy changes dependent on her location, thus making it difficult to accurately make comparisons of data. So, what is the answer to all the confusion about race? Some researchers suggest that we not look at race, but rather the social and political processes that race represents. Some suggest looking at race only to monitor progress toward eliminating racial disparities. What are your own thoughts? In response to the notion that confounding race could lead to lack of consistency for comparing data, There are standard racial categories that have been established in the U.S. The U.S. Office of Management and Budget, OMB, by way of Directive 15, established the current racial categories in order to provide consistent and comparable data on race and ethnicity throughout the federal government for an array of statistical and administrative programs. According to the directive, the categories represent a political social construct to be used to collect data on the race and ethnicity of major broad population groups in the U.S. and are not anthropologically or scientifically based. Here you can see the standard racial categories as they were determined in 1977 and then again in 1997. What differences do you note from one period to the next? Here we have the new category of Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander that removed the Pacific Islander group from the Asian category and also added Native Hawaiians. It wasn't until the 1980s that federal statistics were routinely reported for Latinos or Asians. Also of note is that the 2000 census was the first time that a respondent could mark multiple races. Before that time, imagine that someone of mixed racial background was essentially forced to choose one race. What were the implications of that? What about the race group that the person did select? What about the race group that they did not select? What about the race group that they selected from 1 year to the next? And what does or did all of this mean as it relates to how we interpret federal data? These are all questions for you to consider. So, here's the question about ethnicity from the 2010 census to illustrate how it was measured. And here's the question about race. How do you feel about the categories listed above? Where do you fit? Do these categories make sense to you? Is this the best way to categorize people? Should these categories change in the near future? What determines the need to make revisions? Lots of interesting and thought-provoking questions that I hope to help you answer through the course of this term. Remember that your discussion board assignment is an opportunity for you to discuss these issues and or respond to some of the questions that I raise here in the context of the lecture. This slide depicts how the U.S. Census Bureau collects and categorizes data on race and ethnicity. Here we have a quote from the census website that states, "The U.S. Census Bureau collects race data in accordance with guidelines provided by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and these data are based on self-identification. The racial categories included in the census questionnaire generally reflect a social definition of race recognized in this country and not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. In addition, it is recognized that the categories of the race item include racial and national origin or sociocultural groups." This slide describes in more detail how the census defines the different racial categories of white, black or African American, and American Indian and Alaska Native. White is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. It includes people who indicate their race as white or report entries such as Irish, German, Italian, Lebanese, Arab, Moroccan, or Caucasian. Black or African American is defined as a person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa. It includes people who indicate their race as black, African American, or Negro, or report entries such as African American, Kenyan, Nigerian, or Haitian. American Indian and Alaska Native is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, and who maintains tribal affiliation or community attachment. This category includes people who indicate their race as American Indian or Alaska Native, or report entries such as Navajo, Blackfeet, Inupiat, Yupik, or Central American Indian groups, or South American Indian groups. Asian is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. It includes people who indicate their race as Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, and other Asian, or provide other detailed Asian responses. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. It includes people who indicate their race as Native Hawaiian, Guamanian or Chamorro, Samoan, and other Pacific Islander, or provide other detailed Pacific Islander responses. The category of two or more races denotes people who may have chosen to provide two or more races, either by checking two or more race response check boxes, by providing multiple responses, or by some combination of check boxes and other responses. So, now that we have some foundation about concepts of race, what does all of this have to do with health? One important notion is that the Census Bureau projections suggest that minority groups will account for a majority of the U.S. population by the year 2050. Actually, 2047 is the most recent estimate that I've heard. Consequently, many of the current health ailments experienced by minority populations will in fact be experienced by a majority of the population. As such, this will result in unprecedented demands on the healthcare system that at best is currently ill-prepared to handle it. What we now call minority health will in fact be the nation's health. Here's one way that the connection between race and health is illustrated. Thomas LaVeist developed a conceptual model of race, ethnicity, and health. Specifically, it illustrates how race is related to race differences and health status. LaVeist identifies three pathways by which race is related to race differences and health status. The first is the social pathway along the left side of the model. According to the model, race is manifested outwardly by way of physiognomy, or more specifically, skin color, and people categorize individuals into race groups. And as this individual operates in society, they are exposed to the societal factors and risks associated with membership in that group. Examples include occupational health hazards, poor quality housing, exposure to discrimination or racism, and poor quality health care. You may remember some of this alluded to when you took the health equity quiz. Access to things in society as simple as good supermarkets, social programs, and egalitarianism, things we can consider along the social pathway, have an influence on the race differences that we see in health status. These factors can be defined as those things that are generally outside of the direct control of the individual. The second pathway is along the right side of the model. Here, we see that there may be cultural or ethnic factors or beliefs that then lead us to behave in certain healthy or unhealthy ways that then lead to race differences in health. The third pathway is through the middle of the model, specifically the link between societal factors and health or illness behavior. According to the model, societal factors can impact one's ability to engage in healthy or unhealthy behaviors. For example, a person's race may lead to certain societal exposures that create a context of poor socioeconomic status, or SES. This low SES may lead to underutilization of the healthcare system and illness behavior, which in turn leads to race differences in health status. In this example, the illness behavior is directly associated with social class, SES level, and indirectly with race. Keep in mind, however, that the way that we commonly see race differences in health explained may lead one to think that there is something inherent about that race group that leads to race differences in health status, rather than uncovering that the underutilization of the health system is what has the direct effect on the race differences in health status. In sum, according to this model, race has an indirect effect on differences in health status through one of three different pathways. So, we've discussed a lot about the race concept today. First, I think it's fair to say that race is indeed a complicated concept. We can conclude that race and ethnicity are social categories rather than biological categories. We discussed the fact that it is important to be sure that when we are referencing race, that we are really interested in race rather than other aspects that are subsumed under race. We should consider devising solutions to all the confusion about race. And finally, we saw that race can influence health indirectly through social and behavioral factors. That does it for the lecture. However, I thought it might be helpful to highlight a few things for the week. First, review the lecture. Check. Review the contents of this week's course content folder. Complete the reading assignments. I will suggest completing the week's reading assignments before reviewing the lectures. Review the episode, The Difference Between Us, of the documentary series Race, The Power of an Illusion. Complete your personal reflection journal entry. Remember to reflect on the film in your narrative. Complete the discussion board assignment. Anything from the lecture, readings, films, and related current events are fair game for exams. The discussion board interaction will be useful in ensuring that you are digesting the material and are also able to articulate responses to any questions that the material raises for you. Keep in mind that, generally speaking, it will be helpful for you to perform steps 1 through 3 during any given week. This term will move pretty quickly, so it will be important to have a strategy for staying organized to ensure your success. As always, feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Talk to you soon.